Hello, and welcome to Freelance Frontiers, a weekly conversation navigating the future of flexible work. I'm Ray Hames, an agency expat, brand side leader, and former freelancer myself. And I'm here with Nick Hammond. Say hi, Nick.
How's it going?
A career freelance creative turned coach. We're here to chat about both sides of the freelance relationship, and we hope that our listeners will find something in here that helps smooth out the bumps along the road working with and as freelancers.
And as always, if you have feedback, insights, questions, or would like to join us on a future episode, just drop us a DM. In our last episode, we talked about trust, both on the freelancer end and the client ends of the spectrum. But today, we're going to be talking about a critical piece of successful projects, and that is the brief.
Dun, dun, dun. So who owns the brief? Personally, I think that there's a really black and white answer here, and it's the client. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I think to piggyback off of that, the client definitely owns the brief itself, but I would also say that the freelancer owns the execution. So I think in my head, I always think of ownership in terms of what can I own on my end. And just making sure that everything is aligned is kind of a collaborative process. So while I think the brief itself is kind of on the client, I do kind of on the freelancer end act as if it's more of a collaborative process to ask more questions and make sure that we both understand that that is kind of the North Star.
I think that totally agree with that. And I think that it might actually be helpful. I'm going to jump off topic for a minute. But as I'm thinking about this, I think that it's helpful to anchor some of our listeners into what a brief really is in a freelance relationship. So a brief it's a document. You put together a document outlining what you're looking for from a freelancer. But ultimately, it's the job description. What are you trying to accomplish? And how does this freelancer's role help you achieve it? And it should also provide some amount of foundational guidance and centralized resources for how somebody that's coming onto the team, brand new, fresh eyes, hasn't worked, with your company or your team before, how do they get their head into the same space as you and your internal team in the shortest amount of time possible? I think that, Nick, you and I have seen briefs all over the spectrum, I'm sure. But I think that it's really important, especially for early managers, to understand how important a quality brief really is into bringing somebody into the fold in a really productive and time efficient way. So I think that it's just worth kind of shouting that out because for you and me, we've done this for years, just saying, oh, the brief, we know what that is. But I recognize that there's some people out there that might not necessarily think about it with the same level of intentionality or importance.
Yeah, and it's the unfortunate side of this, at least from my end, is that I think I see more bad briefs than I do good ones.
Yes.
So yeah, I like this topic because I think it's something to there's a lot of nuance within it, and there's a lot of things to go through that can help you work through some of this stuff when you maybe are experiencing some difficulties on whether it's the client end or the freelancer.
Yeah. And one thing I've noticed in almost every project that I've either led myself or worked on is that who's ever on the freelancing side of the equation ends up having a lot of questions about whatever the client's provided. On the client side, candidly, I've been in situations where I felt like, okay, this is as much information as I have too. Like, we're just going to need to work with this information. I can't answer. The project is not answering questions indefinitely. Like, let's get a move on. But then on the flip side, when I've been in the freelancer shoes, I've absolutely been in situations where I'm like, I have no idea what you're actually asking for me to do. And I need more answers to be able to do a good job. What's your experience, kind of in that vein?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see how on the client end it can be frustrating to have to yield like an absolute ton of questions when all you're trying to do is get started. But I think on the freelancer end, I've also seen it happen where if I don't ask enough questions up front, you can end up going down kind of the wrong path at some point and taking the wrong fork in the road. So I usually on the freelance side err on the side of trying to make sure that I ask more questions. And I think what I usually do to kind of soften that blow is just be a little self-deprecating, like, hey, I tend to ask a little more questions. You're probably going to get annoyed. That way they at least up front know that they're going to have to deal with a lot of it. but then also just providing the explanation of like, the more I ask and get answers to upfront, the better able I will be to help you in the future. Even if the answer is, I don't know, or we don't have that, that's good enough for me to understand, okay, this is why it's happening, versus, having to fly blind and then figure that out halfway through the project.
Totally. In your perfect world, what does a good brief include?
Yeah. I think for me, it's kind of three things. It's usually around context, clarity, and specifics. So for me, my brain works where if I don't have enough information on the context and kind of the broader whole of like why this specific project came to be and how it fits into, larger goals within the company, I have a very hard time making decisions within that. But if I have more information on how this fits into what they're actually doing, it helps, because if we hit a sticking point, I can kind of move back a few steps and say, well, you told me this, this, and this. And, either I have an idea on a different way we can go to help that, or let's work together to figure out what the best solution is based on some of these kind of like higher level things that are happening here.
I think you bring up a really interesting point there, which is both clarity and accountability. So we know that clients change their minds all the time. And that can be frustrating to navigate when you are working in one direction for weeks on end, getting great feedback, and then all of a sudden the circumstances change, you get around to feedback and you're like, where did that come from? That doesn't make any sense. And in those situations, kind of the first line of defense is saying, well, that wasn't part of the brief direction.
Yep.
Right. And I think that at the end of the day, like, the client can change their mind if they want.
Yep.
They're going to have to pay you for extra time. You can put parameters in place so that there's repercussions if directions change. Sure. But certainly, I've spent a lot of time on the client side myself, and there's so many times that a support team, whether they're internal or external, just doesn't have the visibility into what is behind a change in direction. I'm the middleman. Don't shoot the messenger. The direction's changed. But I think that something that I've learned in this process is how important it is to capture details that you do know up front, because in some cases, direction has truly changed and the whole team needs to pivot and we're all marching in a new direction now. But there's other times where it's just feedback for me as a manager to write a better brief next time, And I think that that's a consistent point of learning, of saying what information and guidance helps a team, and what information is not critical, what information could be misdirection, I think is important to think about. Because again, you've got to think about it. It's about leading with empathy, and not like soft and warm and fuzzy empathy, but like true, if I was somebody new to this project, what would I need to know to wrap my head around this? And what's just going to confuse me? I think that that's really important for brief writers in general to consider.
Yeah. And I think too, to kind of tie it into our other topic about trust, I also kind of look for a willingness on both ends to kind of question assumptions. Because I think a lot of times what happens is, if you're stuck in that middle ground of being told, if you're a middle manager and you're being told something, but you don't necessarily have as much of the context, I think it helps on both ends, whether it's the freelancer or the client, to be able to say, okay, well, I got handed this, but maybe I don't necessarily know what decision-making led to this specific thing wanting to be done. And a lot of times, if you can go back a few steps ahead of you, whether that's the freelancer or the client, you can kind of, either confirm that where you're headed is the right direction, or start to kind of understand, maybe we can try this, but maybe also there's this other thing that we can do that can also, get us to where we want to go, but is maybe not necessarily something that people thought about before I was handed the brief.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when you think about real executional level things, but let's say that you're being tasked with designing new ad creative. So things that are helpful in that situation are having that historical context of what's been tested before, not just what's the concept, what's the brand, what are you trying to communicate, but what's been tested before, what's performed well and what hasn't performed well. Because then if you're coming into a project with fresh eyes, you can immediately build on those learnings as opposed to have to create those learnings for yourself, you know, in your new batch of work. So I think that that's an interesting point too, of just figuring out, you know, in a concise way, how can you share what's happened before now.
Yeah, and that's also why on the freelance end, I love to ask those clarifying questions up front to get a feel for what someone else has done before, who they've worked with, because I think you can also kind of tease out things that maybe weren't included in the brief that they forgot about for some reason, where you're like, okay, this is a specific style choice or, you know, direction that we went down that didn't work. And if they didn't include it and you know, you didn't ask the question and now you've delivered something that looks like something they tried a year ago and fell flat on its face, well, not only are you back to square one, but you've kind of ruined a little bit of trust there. And it just feels like that's not a great, you know, way to continue a working relationship. So
Yeah.
that's where I kind of err on the side of taking a little bit of the hit up front in asking more of those questions, because it just makes the process toward the end so much more fluid.
Well, ultimately, you're saving time, right? You can have a 10-minute discussion. What worked, what didn't, what have you tried before? That can save hours and hours, days, weeks of work that would otherwise result in the same, you know, in the same direction. So I think that that's an important piece to think about, and like, not for anybody that's listening and feel self-conscious about asking those types of questions. It's like, when you put it in those terms, a 10-minute conversation can save days worth of work. Ask the questions.
Yeah. And on the freelancer end too, I think it also helps you to understand where your client sits in terms of how much contextual information they have. Because I think there's also varying degrees of that, where depending on where they sit in an organization, they might always have a lot more information that when you do ask the questions, you do get more information back. But then there's sometimes where they don't have the access, and you asking more questions isn't going to get more information. And so I think it can help you to approach those situations differently, where maybe sometimes you get handed a brief and you just go, okay, this is what it is, and I just have to work with it, versus, okay, let me question a little more up front and try and tease more out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
So yeah, to kind of bring it back and focus a little bit more on the client end of things, how much time do you usually spend on writing briefs before you deliver to a freelancer?
Well, it depends on the project in general, but I think I take brief writing really seriously. I think that it's a absolute cornerstone of being able to set a project up for success with a flexible team, and that aligning people to a single brief is a great foundation for that. So in general, I try to write a single brief for a project as opposed to individual contributors. What is included in that brief, I try to think about what's the background. Like, you know, if I'm working on behalf of a client, if I'm working on behalf of my own company, what's the background of the client at hand, right? What does their business do? What are they trying to achieve? This should be like 3 sentences, you know, but it's some upfront information that helps anchor the team in what the business does and what the business's objective is, right? Is it to drive SaaS subscriptions? Is it to sell, you know, more cupcakes? Whichever it is.
Both fantastic things.
Yeah, we heart conversions. But whatever it is, the team needs to know that their work impacts the bottom line of the business in a specific way. And then you talk about the overview of the project. We are working on a 360 campaign that will launch this fall to announce 7 new cupcake flavors and drive foot traffic to the cupcake store. And then from there, you can get into the specifics of the history. You can talk, and this is variable sections of a brief, right? You can talk about campaign history. You can talk about, you know, I always have a section for resources. So whether we're talking about, this could be a brief to come up with campaign concepts. It could be a brief to execute on those concepts. But in either case, you want to give your team inspiration and guardrails to say, do it like this, not like that. And to have a brand resources section within the brief that anybody can quickly click into and say, okay, here's the brand guidelines. Here's the art files from last year's campaign. Here's links to the live work, the top performers from last year. And then specifically, as you kind of get into sections for specific skill sets or specific contributors, this is where you talk about deliverables. And you say, here's the timeline, here's the specific. I like to outline rounds. I think that it's reasonable to plan, personally, as a rule of thumb, just general rule of thumb, I think it's reasonable to plan for 3 rounds, like an initial round, a feedback round, and a refinement final round. The refinement final round should be very lightweight, small edits. But the first round is like, are we all saying the same language? And the second round is getting close to final work. Any more than that, there's a lot of back and forth. I just think we should all hold ourselves accountable to like not go in an endless feedback loop.
I completely agree.
But so I like to outline my timeline for rounds because that helps a freelancer react and say, yeah, I can deliver on that timeline. Or knowing the scope of work involved, I'm going to need a few more days to get to round 1. It's always the heaviest lift. And I think that those things are generally for me open for discussion, right? Like I'm putting a stake in the ground saying, here's what I want to have happen. Here's the end due date for all of this. I got to have this done by the due date, but the dates in between, do these work for you? Can you commit to them? And then the specific deliverables and output at each round. I like to think that I can be flexible on this front with the freelancers. It really depends on the project at hand. But like what I've learned is like the first round, it's a waste of everybody's time to see a bunch of sizes and iterations and versions in the first round. The first round is about concepting, is about general, are we all headed in the right direction? Let's pick one, and then the second round is where you see kind of a full, if we're talking about a creative campaign, yep. I think that's where you see a bigger bulk of the work. But the point being is that within the brief, you're giving a very high level overview of what the company is, what your team does, what the campaign needs to achieve, and then drilling down into the specifics of what the team and individual contributors need to bring to the table to complete the project at hand. And then it's all in one place. I think that it's really important for it to be a single, crisp document. Nobody wants to be chasing answers in like decades old PowerPoints or spreadsheets. Make it really simple for your team. Because again, this is about being empathetic to who's on the other end of this, which is how can I quickly help somebody who's brand new understand what I need and understand what it looks like to me to do good work. And sending them down a path with a bunch of messy, half-done documents is, I don't think, respectful of other people's time. And I don't think that you can expect people to fill in the gaps within your own communication shortfalls. So I think, again, it goes back to kind of what I said at the top, which is like, I take brief writing really seriously. And there's always more to learn. There's always ways that we can all get better at that. And it depends on the team as well. If you've worked with them forever and they've worked on the same campaigns quarter over quarter, you can kind of get by, saying, here's what's new. But from a foundational level, I think that it's a real career skill to be able to write a good brief.
I completely agree. And I think maybe chat for a different discussion is sex and maybe
yes.
Things that we've seen that have ended up in not great situations.
Useful or not. We would love for you to follow us here and over on LinkedIn for more tips on how you can get the most of working with and as freelance talent.